I'm glad to be here to assist your community in the conversations that you're starting to have. They're very important conversations. And I want you to know that there are people like you in neighborhoods across our whole country that are starting to have these conversations. So it's quite a positive thing, and it's quite a Canadian thing at the moment for that to happen. As Marie said, I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes, give you a little bit of background. And then I really prefer, once we can get into a conversation, and Marie's agreed to be the MC for that conversation, I think it'll be a much more rich experience for you if you guys can guide that conversation to where you want it to go. But Marie, I do want to ask you, when it hits 20 minutes, I want you to yell and scream and shut me up, because I might go on too long. So I'm going to try not to, but just let me know. Yeah, okay. Um, so first, I have to do a disclaimer. I'm not here to intervene or even to comment on your community conversation or the issues that you're dealing with, or frankly, the political process that you will be involved in as you choose. And I'm not here to advocate any specific solution or course of action for you. That would be a little bit presumptuous on my part. I know some of your issues, but I don't have a decently credible understanding of them, or the political situation, or the players. What I am here to talk about is what is good Canadian planning practice when it comes to neighborhoods and when it comes to public involvement. And what should any Canadian expect from their local government, from all government, when we're dealing with these issues? And I come from a place, just so you know my philosophy, where I believe that cities are built up from their neighborhoods. If a neighborhood's not going to work, and many neighborhoods don't work, a city starts to come apart. You can have one or two neighborhoods in trouble, and then you have to try to deal with those. But when you have widespread neighborhood dissatisfaction, and that, your city starts to lose its coherence, and things start to happen that are fairly negative. So I'm going to talk about the practice of planning, because planning is how we keep our neighborhoods together as we move through the years. And then I'm going to talk about how you, as a citizen, can effectively participate in planning your community, both in the optimal situation, which I'll quickly describe, and then in more difficult situations where you may not feel as empowered. And hopefully I can help you, give you some ideas to inspire your own creative thinking about how you move forward in those circumstances. So to start, a responsible planning service to you at the neighborhood level has several qualities that you should expect. The first is that it should be an active process. You should know when it's starting, when it's finishing, when it'll happen again. And it should be well advertised, so widely people know that these conversations are going on, not just a few of the interested people or the insiders or things like that. Second, it should deal with the unique issues that are in a neighborhood and frame local solutions. One size does not fit all. Neighborhoods are very different, and the vibrancy and wonder of Canadian cities is that we have unique neighborhoods, special neighborhoods. Now, sometimes for efficiency, we can put the legalities together and have some generalities, but it's always good to keep as much differentiation in neighborhoods as you can. Next, you should realize that even when you're doing neighborhood planning, you are also responsible for citywide policies, things your whole community wants to do, whether it be sustainability or inclusiveness or Indigenous reconciliation, whatever it might be. You have to reconcile those things with the neighborhood needs and the neighborhood approach and the neighborhood personality. And this takes a lot of brokering, and it means that every neighborhood finds a way to move forward consistent with those wide goals, but also without losing their charm and uniqueness and specialty. Next is a neighborhood planning process always listens to local people. It is not done by technocrats, just you see, the Robert Moses types that are swathing where the streets will be and all that. No. In today's world, it has to be done with people, and it has to respond really specifically to their views. It needs to track the outcomes from those conversations so people can see how their inputs were affected. Sometimes it'll have to be explained where they couldn't adopt an idea that someone had. So it has to be systematic and inclusive, and it needs to be a fulsome process. And frankly, good neighborhood planning is not the quickest thing in the world. Sometimes it can take months. Well, you need that time for people to get to know one another, to have conversations, and make concessions they begin to learn that they need to make to be a citizen of the wider city as well as in their neighborhood. And then it always reviews outcomes from time to time. Yes, you publish plans, you change zoning, but the world is always changing. Neighborhoods are always changing. And so you have to go back from time to time. And when you do that, you have to do more consultation and bring more people in. So that sounds all very positive, and it is happening in some of our cities, but it's not happening in some other of our cities as coherently as we would like. And why is that? Well, there's several reasons. It's important that you know that you become understanding of those reasons. First is budget limitations. If you have 25, 30 neighborhoods and you only have five planners, you have to decide what you're going to do first, second, third, fourth, and you may have to put things in some order. Secondly, around the country now, that sometimes it's the planner's philosophy. Sometimes planners are becoming more technocratic. We've got to do this or our society's going to fall apart, rather than being conveners. And sometimes they're kind of afraid of being the conveners because that puts them on the hot seat. And they can't just be the proselytizing people to say you need sustainability and you need this and you need that. They've also got to work with people face to face, and that can be harder to do. And frankly, our training across Canada of planners doesn't include as much neighborhood in a consultation as it used to include. Thirdly, many times there are political limitations and boundaries that are put on planners by the elected officials. Instructions are given. Sometimes you have to do that for an urgency. Your city's in trouble on some major thing and you have to override and make some fast and hard decisions. Usually it's the result of political inclinations and political philosophy more than anything else. So you have to keep that in mind. And I want to emphasize, when you find yourself in a situation, I hear that you are somewhat in this situation. Don't just blame the whole system. Be careful and identify where the problem is, because your allies may look like your enemies. And so you want to find out, where is the problem? Who's causing this problem? Now, in a responsive and responsible planning service, there will always be that framework of public involvement that I've already mentioned. It'll be offered, and it'll foster what I would call an easy involvement by a wide variety of citizens. It'll be inclusive. We like to call it the triangle of citizen participation. That's where a few citizens want to be very, very involved, and there are committees and things like that. Some citizens want to be sort of involved, so they'll talk to you through their neighborhood organization or at the daycare or something. And then a few citizens are just so busy they can't be involved, but they want to vote on polls. And, but when you put it all together in a picture, you get a really good picture. Now, that's systematic public involvement. And your role as a citizen, when it's happening, is to participate. You have a responsibility to participate within the framework, but also to be evaluating and monitoring that process for its integrity, because sometimes it can lose its integrity. But then you feed in your perspectives. You help the planners find those balances between one another in a community, and between the community and other communities, and between the community and the city as a whole. You help them on that. And we call that interest-based problem solving, where we're always trying to take our interests and not trade them off, you win, you lose, but instead bring them into an alignment where everyone can move forward. We don't all get what we want in the city, the complexity of the city, but we should all feel some comfort that we've been heard, and our ideas have been taken into consideration. Now, for a planning service that is widely not meeting those local needs, or maybe it's moribund, or maybe it's passive, or maybe it's just silent, it may be the most responsible thing that you can do as a citizen is to come together with other citizens and convene your own local planning process that will articulate your collective neighborhood community views and your needs so that they can be understood. And we all know that instead of every individual citizen going and speaking to their government, one voice each, that there is more powerful in a coherent set of voices that have thought out what they're thinking about their neighborhood and can bring positive ideas to the political process. And, it's kind of made to be complex. To some degree, government and planners mystify these local planning processes. They use a lot of jargon. They talk about a lot of complicated data collection and analysis, and they use a lot of legalese, frankly. But I don't want any citizen to be fooled by that, because actually neighborhood planning is pretty simple. It's just figuring out what is right and wrong in your neighborhood at the level of people you are with day to day, week to week. It's about reconciling your differences, being inclusive to make sure you see the wide variety in your community, but then reconciling those differences. It's solving human problems, sometimes as physical solutions, sometimes organizational solutions, and then it's presenting your outcomes effectively. And to give a reference to this, I always like to say, think about your own family, the way you get together with your family and you sort out what needs to happen in your family and you stay together as a result of that as a family. Or think about when you're planting a garden. I'm going to tell you, neighborhood planning is no harder than when you're planting a garden. Now, doing your own neighborhood planning is about getting together, having a conversation, agreeing on ways forward, putting it on paper and sharing it with others and testing it. And you can replicate what the planners are not able or not willing to do. Now, sometimes the planners would love to do it, but they just don't have a budget or not. But even sometimes they will come and join you in the conversations. And that's always pretty good, because they can then take it back to City Hall and be your advocate when those ideas come forward to City Hall. And we need to be together and try to find those allies, even within the governments that we don't think are working as well as they might. So anytime you want, you can convene a community conversation, find resources, explore and articulate a community vision, prepare results, and advocate. And I always say, and I say this in neighborhoods right across our country, if government isn't or won't do it, then you can do it. And you need to do it. And unfortunately, through the last couple of decades, government has made it sound like maybe you can't do it or you'd be irrelevant when you do it. I'm going to remember back when I was a kid, when actually most of this kind of planning was done spontaneously by people just like you. And we had to learn it as professionals. And if it's getting a little bit, institutionalized, then you have to come back into the equation as citizens to help us loosen it back up. So I want to just cover each of those very quick. Convening the conversation. Now, we think that's hard, but look what you've done already. You've got a coalition of neighborhoods going. I'm sure in every neighborhood there's a group of you. you probably started by just getting a group of your neighbors together around the kitchen table and arguing and debating. I like to start that way. I'll get 5 people together and I'll say, well, let's meet tomorrow morning and let's bring a 2 or 3 people with you. And we go over and we get a few iterations. And before you know it, we have a number of people. Now, we have to be careful that we, if our community has an ethnicity or an age specialty or something like that, that we don't just have our friends. We don't just have those who agree with us. We try to broaden out the conversation. And that's ethically the right thing to do. But it doesn't take, big machines of public relations or all that at the neighborhood level to convene a conversation. It just takes you taking a bit of time and effort to do that. Maybe you collect a few resources, as I know BetterInfill did at the beginning. Sometimes you can find other resources. And that is the second thing. Where do you find those resources? Where do you find the people that can do all these mysterious things that local planners talk about? Well, sometimes you just collect the hat with some money. Sometimes there will be places where you can get grants. More often, the first place I like to look is right within your neighborhood. There are going to be people in your neighborhood that are good writers, that are good drawers, that are good thinkers. They might be planners. They might be architects. They might be landscape architects, which we often find. And they can come in and sometimes you'll bring a guy like me in for just one session and give you some ideas and off you go. There are resources all over the place. And with a few resources cobbled together, you can usually get going on a neighborhood planning process. The next is exploring and articulating that vision. It doesn't take a lot of detailed analysis. All over the world, we do it simply by having workshops. We have a funny name for it. We call them charrettes, but it's really just workshops where people come together, usually have a pen and paper, and we draw out things. And a cool thing to do, for example, is to get around a room with unroll a roll of paper. It can be, you can buy at the local store, and to just draw your neighborhood. Where are the streets? Where are the blocks? And then say to yourself, okay, where's the good things? Where are the bad things? Where are the services? Where is the problem? And then from that, you can start identifying the problem. At a certain point after you've done that a bit, it's often good to say, okay, what is it we want our neighborhood to be? And try to articulate some goals for your community. And maybe identify a list of issues that you want to deal with. But as you can see, that's not taking any kind of super analysis. In fact, whereas some planners will tell you need a lot of data and you can't really see an area unless you have all that data. No, realize that your work is always going to go through a process of review and confirmation, and there will be data collected. But the first thing is just to get your ideas on the table, to get your things articulated that you want to make sure are considered. And sometimes they're not even shown in the data. We had a time when we had what was called urban renewal, and they forgot about all the local people in these communities and wiped out some of the nicest communities in North America. That was back in the 50s. And we got rid of that because it's not just all about data. It is about you, your family, and your ideas. And then you prepare the results. As I said, you will find a person in your neighborhood who's a good writer or who can draw, but it is important not to just leave it as talk, because talk is air and air gets lost. But when you write something down and you draw it up, it doesn't have to be beautiful. It doesn't have to be, extraordinary. It's pretty cool when you can make it interesting because it'll be evocative. But you get it documented. And then advocacy. You've got to then know where to take it and how to take it. And that means the people in your community who are the best speakers are the ones you highlight. You say, okay, Mary, this is your time. We want you to now be our spokesman. Or Bob, you can draw really well. Be drawing the pictures as Mary's speaking. And through that sort of thing, you become a powerful advocate. And the more of you that are advocating together, the more likely that someone is going to feel they have to listen. It's actually not only in their interest, it's for their own survival. And then, of course, that takes you into the political process. And you will find, on the one hand, either within that current status quo, there are some people that are, this is resonating for them and they'll reach out and become your helper, or you have to finally go to the polls and you have to bring hundreds of other people to the polls and change the people who are at the other end with the delegated power. I like to think that in a responsive government, that even if it's been a little uncaring, once it sees several hundred or several, even better, several thousand people standing up with some ideas, they're going to start paying attention. And that has been usually the case in my life. Now, we can talk more about this a little later, but I want to close just with a few cues to help you not fall into some of the common traps, I'll call it, when you take off on this, because it's a little risky. You're doing something important in your community. You should be very proud of you and your neighbors who spend some time and effort on this, because it is important. First is, try to reflect those elements that I had called out as I don't know, I think I called it the model of good citizen participation. Try to have an understandable process, deal with the uniqueness, reconcile with citywide and society-wide perspectives, listen to other people in your community, and then, put it all together on paper and go from time to time back into the discussion. So it's kind of a thing is to go back to double check from time to time. Second thing is, make sure you are inclusive. The worst thing is when a group gets together and says, we represent the neighborhood, and they don't. So you have a responsibility to represent and we often have what we call a majority view and a minority view on issues, and that's okay. That's good. We're in a democracy. We're free people with free ideas. And often you can look at a normal, typical neighborhood profile. They're usually on every website that will tell you the different kinds of folks that are in your neighborhood to make sure that you include them. A very important thing is to be more positive than negative. When we feel we're not being heard, we tend to become negative. We get mad. I call them the nomads, the people who always say no and they're always mad. And don't be a nomad. Instead, be a person who, yes, while you're articulating the issues, are also talking about solutions. Realize that other people do have to make decisions about how do we manage growth and how do we accommodate the diversity we need and how do we get the resources we need, how do we move around, and choices have to be made. Be the person that contributes to the positive opportunities and ideas, not just the negative. One of the things that planners and politicians love to use is the word NIMBY, not in my backyard. Well, I don't like that word, and I've been advocating in my profession that they remove the word from the lexicon. When I see a NIMBY person, not in my backyard, they're the first person I want to talk to, because I have to understand what is worrying them so much. Why can't we achieve our societal goals without hurting them so much? And what can we do to moderate how we achieve our societal goals and still not alienate people too much? We're all looking for a way forward together in a democracy, and we live so close together. Another is, you do have to reflect the citywide and societal problems. You can't just say, this is my neighborhood and this is what we want. No growth, no change, no nothing. Your neighborhood, your community does need to accommodate. It's an organic thing. And then what you're doing already, I don't need to remind you of this, build those coalitions that go across one neighborhood, but try to build them on the basis of shared ideas, not just the people. I remember a time in Vancouver when things were very confused, and the Planning Commission, which is a citizens organization, took all the ideas of all the neighborhoods and they put it into what they call the goals for Vancouver. And that changed our whole city because politicians couldn't ignore that. It represented the views of tens of thousands of people, and it was a way forward. Remember that nothing that is happening in your city is set in stone unless it's absolutely built and finished. People say, well, we have that new zoning. That's it. That's the end of that. Remember that laws are just words on paper that burn up in fires and get torn up by people. And you can make change. You can help write the new laws. And also know that every city is changing slowly. So even if something's wrong and it's been there a year or two and you're worried sick about it, it probably hasn't changed your whole city yet. And if you can help to fix it, you will save your neighborhood and your city. And at the same time, remember that cities are always changing. Your needs are changing. Your family's getting older. You're getting older. And that always needs to be brought into the equation. And then finally, I would say, you got to make this fun. If you want people to participate in the modern times, it has to be fun, enjoyable. You have to laugh a lot. There needs to be food. A bit of wine's not bad either. You have to make it something that people want to be a part of. And I like to say a good community planning process is really a community building process and a community consolidating process. And I've seen people who come out of it with friendships that become the glue of the community for the next 5 to 10 years. And that's what you want to make it. And you always want it to be respectful. So I hope this has been a few just cues on ideas on ways and means and things to look out for. And we'll talk about more of this as we're talking back and forth. But just to summarize, first, understand why planning is being delivered the way it is in your community so that you can zero in on a fix, not just a critique that gets lost in the air. Second, it is right and it is easy to get right down to planning in your own community if you feel it's really necessary, and otherwise people are not being heard. Third is any popular movement that will find a leader. I've seen people when they really get together and the people run to the front to lead them because they see that it's important. And any popular leader with a group behind them in our local government will find a voice of power to make change. And that's the optimism that you can still have in any city in this country with the democracy, even if these issues look very tight and very entrenched. No, you can make change. So Marie, I'll turn it back to you and let's just open this for conversation.
That's wonderful. Thank you for getting us started and planting some ideas. Larry, I just want to remind everybody that this session is being recorded. So I want you to know that, and we're going to be putting a link up of this session, both on our BetterInfill website and maybe up on YouTube. So I just want you to know that before we want to encourage you to talk about it. I also, we don't need wine. We have brownies and carrot and coffee. And so when the Q&A is over, we really like to have a bite, chat with some different neighborhoods. And Larry might not be here, but we want you to stay and reach out to some. May know it. So we're going to get started, Larry, with some questions from the audience. And I think I'll just start off with one. I keep on wanting to look up at you, but I'm going to look right here. Larry, all of us feel so much about being Edmontonians, partially because the Oilers are playing tonight. And we really feel Edmonton. But I think that what we're seeing and feeling in our own city, which has felt discouraging for the last little while, last 2 years, we're not alone. Things are happening across the country, perhaps in other communities, different. But can you talk about some of the experiences of other Canadian cities grappling with the issues that we're dealing with? Densification.
Yeah.
Etc. Just a few ideas.
Yeah, just a couple minutes on that. It's interesting. After I did a webinar with BetterInfill a few months ago, a gentleman called me from Regina, and he said, gosh, we're having similar issues here. How can, can we talk to you, and what might we do? We have a group in Vancouver that are beginning to go right back to neighborhood organization, because they feel that in our city here, that sometimes when it comes to the neighborhood, some of the overriding issues of society, like affordability, are in a sense trumping the issues that matter at the local level. And people are getting short-tempered about those broader issues and are trading off the concerns of at the local level, which we can never do. And so they're organizing. I've just heard in Toronto, where they have a history actually of neighborhood level planning, because they have a ward system for their communities. Even there, people are feeling that the public engagement process has become particularly rote. And not necessarily listen to, okay, we have our public meeting, but I was going to do that anyway, so that's what I'm going to do. That sort of message, and that's bothering people. And so this is a conversation that's being had all over the country. And I will tell you, my message is the same everywhere. It is the same message that people were saying to me when I was a young planner. We will do it. We will articulate, and we won't miss the issues of affordability and sustainability. We'll include those, but we will also include what we think is important. And government's been better for that for close to 50 years in our country. But, people get kind of lazy, or budgets get cut, or all of that. And it's important that it be refreshed.
I'd like to open it up. Yes, I'll start here. And I think I'm going to repeat some of the questions.
Yeah, you're going to have to, because you're kind of coming in and out. So I may not be able to hear you as much as you'd like. So do repeat, Marie.
Our city planners, I have become, because they're doing West reporting on my our neighborhood plans now, my daughter plans now. How do we, what language do we use to our city planners who may be trying to do their best in planning, leaving trees, doing all that kind of stuff, to have them advocate to developers who put things forward, overriding some bylaws that make no sense? What kind of language do we use to bring them on side so they can also advocate to their boss lady who's saying, I have a vision? So what you taught them, I'm sure you've taught some, what you've taught them can come to fruition, and they don't have to, it's a city job. They don't have to, they can be planners, good planners, instead of city employees. Is there something we can do in the way we speak to them to bring them on side so they can be on our team? Larry, did you hear that?
I think I did hear that. Here's my reaction, and do tell me if I've fallen short of what you were hoping to learn about. The best way that you can empower your planners is to build your voices to a wide enough spectrum of echoes, so that when they speak to politicians, the politician knows there are 1,000 voices behind them. When I was the planner of Vancouver, I made sure that whenever I took something forward on a policy change or that I had thousands of citizens, and I had made sure that we had sorted out the differences and the worries and the concerns. Unfortunately, they don't have as much time as I might have had in my time. They're under a lot of pressure. And so the more through your community processes, you can echo voices that they may philosophically believe in, the more that they will be heard automatically. Secondly, is often when I've been involved in localized processes, often as a volunteer. What I like to do is invite the planners to come and sit with us. It's one thing to have to be responsible for a whole planning process day in and day out. It's another thing to come and sit for 2 hours. And if they come and they will naturally learn the concerns, and they'll start to sort in their minds. They're problem-solving people, so they'll say, well, how do I deal with that? How do I deal with that? And then they become slowly advocates for a wider perspective. They're being pushed hard on some issues like affordability. They're being said, the hell with local people, we just got to get more housing built. Whether that's true or not, we could have a big debate. But that's how they're being pushed. But if they see the power of the other issues, they start to put the reconciliations in their own mind and then speaking those in the advocacy of meetings that you'll never be able to be in. It's not a case where you sort of say, okay, I've got to convert that planner. No, it's more an organic thing where you have to, give them the opportunity to learn in the same way your community is learning what the subtle issues are, and then and adopt that in their own philosophy and their own thinking, and then give them the power of the strength of your voices. It really is the best way to go.
Yeah, my question is about this missing middle that has become a buzzword. And now I hear others being applied to other cities. So what is the missing middle and how will it help things?
Well, most people, when they talk about the missing middle, are really talking about what has emerged right across the country, even in smaller cities, which is that unaffordability of the city to the middle class. Our cities usually have subsidy programs for our lowest income folks, lowest 20%. Federal programs, provincial programs, one program or another. I'm not saying they're the best, because we know we have a lot of homelessness in our cities all over the country. And anyone can compete for that wonderful, $2 million apartment that if they're wealthy. And often people coming into the country or having made wealth in the country, or people that have stepped up from one unit to another, can be the people who take those units. And what that leaves often is people in the middle income people, maybe going for their first home with their first mortgage. Gosh, when I was a kid, it was possible. It's harder now. We know, for example, that in many cities, it's becoming a family matter. Parents are taking the equity out of their homes, taking some loans, subsidizing their children to get that first down payment and that mortgage that's realistic. But the people who are really left out are the people who don't have that kind of equity somewhere in the equation. Why is it important? Well, it's important because they're often the people who give you the services you need every day: the doctors, the dentists, the fire department, all those people. In some countries, they have what they call missing middle housing or worker housing, they'll call it in Australia, where they actually accommodate and subsidize that housing. We didn't have to do that. When I was a chief planner, I never thought of subsidizing middle income housing. But in countries as wide as Spain and throughout Europe and Australia and other cities now, yes, we're certainly identifying certain segments of that middle population that we're trying to help. A city cannot function with just the very rich and the very poor. It will be in constant crisis for one reason or another. So it does need that wonderful balance. But that doesn't mean that everything else about that city should be traded off. Because the irony is that when a city becomes unlivable because you've traded off everything for the missing middle, the first people to leave is the missing middle. They'll go to another city. So.
Larry, you've spoken of a triangle of community engagement, drivers at the top to take care of people, and then the rest of the people my question to you is, do you have any suggestions, best practices for how to engage that group at the bottom once they've kind of lost hope and given up?
Yeah. Often we use the tools that we should be using for that wide group at the bottom. We're using them up at the top. So that small group at the top, they will join committees, be coalitions, like you guys are them. You'll spend some time and energy and money, and you'll work on this, and you'll make it one of your. Some people, I have friends through my work that, they call this is my hobby. They love to do it, and you give them the committees and all that to do that. If you're at the bottom, those people should be offered public meetings where they can come once a year or twice a year just to make their views known. They need polling where they can just vote on something, yay or nay. Often, interestingly enough, you use the real active folks to frame how best to reach those folks who are less active. So you let them frame the issues and the questions in a way that people they know who can't participate will react and respond, even the wording you use and how you do it. So that's, and what's important is that you not have one or the other. It's important that you have all these layers coming together, which is not hard to do now that we have, so much social media. Because the other thing you can do with that very wide audience at the bottom is that you can convene the conversation, quite a rich conversation, where they participate, when and how they want to participate. And often it's on their phones and et cetera, et cetera. All those, the chat rooms and the access and that and the other. That all can happen. One of the best first examples of all that applied to planning was in the Netherlands. And what they did, the planner just loved to talk to people digitally and started these amazing conversations that would go on for weeks, and anyone could be involved. I might go there once or twice or three times, or maybe if I found something really interesting, I would be regular. And it was a really good way to get data and information and opinion. It's always a process of invention. We can never stop inventing. And one of the problems we see in my profession is that we have, the four techniques that are tried and true, and we just apply them randomly. And sometimes they're not working anymore. People don't go to public meetings the way they used to go to public meetings. And so we need these other techniques.
So I appreciate the teachings around really thoughtful neighborhood planning process. And that's sort of some things we get back to many of us communities. Maybe an unfair question here, Larry. Some of us are feeling we're at war with the industry as we speak. Conflict in many of our neighborhoods is quite extensive. Any sort of insights or thoughts in terms of what we can do in the very short term, talking weeks or maybe a couple of months? Because we feel in some of our neighborhoods, the industry and people that want to make a buck are buying up properties left, right, and center. And to engage them in the planning process is in fact quite long term. But they're looking at the listings every day and saying, "Oh, there's a sweet one, I'm gonna buy that one." And that's happening in many of our neighborhoods, including the one I live in. So it's a pretty unfair possibly, but like looking at weeks really in terms of what strategies we might, we consider to kind of deflect some of that until we can do some proper neighborhood planning, which I love that notion. That's outstanding.
I think I understood that. Unfortunately, people are cutting in and out a little bit, but let me try answering. First, of course, always remember the actual rhythm of change is determined by the rhythm of approvals for change of development, which are determined by the local government based on policy and availability of resources. Some governments, when they realize through a very articulated view of the public that there's a problem, can put a moratorium on an area and say, we'll pause that area and do a bit of study. If the government is not predisposed to do that, in general, some other communities have done what they call a rate of change analysis. A rate of change analysis simply identifies in a community how fast is change occurring. And if your community decides it's occurring too fast, then you can put a pause, not a moratorium, but just a pause on how quickly you do approvals. But frankly, when you're if you're in a situation where government is not prepared to take that action, they've already decided the more housing, the better for affordability, for example, the best way is to be very noisy. The best way is to make it quite clear that something has got to be done, and that your neighborhood as one is going to be engaged very proactively in the political process to make sure something is done. And let me tell you what happens. A lot of development begins with speculation. Speculation is when someone says, let's buy a piece of land in this place, which is pretty soon going to change, and we have very little risk that it will not change, that it will change. We know it will. Well, then they'll buy that land, and they'll start the process for however long it takes. However, if an area is hotly contested, a lot of speculators will not go there simply because it's too risky and they stand to lose too much money. So that's why the transparency of these kind of processes that I've talked about is so important. And you can, for example, convene a charrette in your neighborhood within 3 weeks. You'd have to give more time than just a day or two, but within 3 weeks you could convene a charrette. And let's say 100 people came out of that charrette and make a lot of noise, and not just negative, but talk about what we want our community to be. Well, that's going to cause the risk level to go up for the speculator and the developer who doesn't care anything about you, just wants to get a project and make their profits. By the way, I don't like to demonize developers. A lot of developers are not into that. They understand communities, and I think you even had an article by a developer that was worried about some insensitivity of other developers that someone referenced for me recently. So, but there are speculators out there, and there are developers who act like speculators also.
In a lot of neighborhoods where there's people knocking on doors saying, "I just love to live in this neighborhood," and of course, it's not them. They're just acting want to buy out as much as possible, and it has to do with the monetization of property and rental properties that I don't think we saw necessarily 20, 30 years ago. But that's what we're.
But for example, someone, I think Kevin mentioned at the beginning, you had some signs there. Well, I can tell you, a neighborhood that had a sign on every lawn is going to be a neighborhood of speculators going to try to avoid.
Good point. That's a pretty good point. $10 a sign. $10 a sign. Yes. Larry, thanks very much for this. I'm just going to give you a bit of history here with this. Maybe help us to figure out how to deal with something. So, we're in the charter cities of Calgary and Edmonton. And in the charter, they changed the MGA and a number of things. And one of the things they required was that charter city have to pass a bylaw to say how they're going to do public consultation and allow them to do digital public consultation. Edmonton's bylaw just said they have to post major rezonings and on the city's website. That's all. There's no further requirement for that consultation. And then, since that's what they've been doing, they haven't been engaging with people. So they engaged with people in 2018 and 2019 for the new city plan. They incorporated the zoning bylaw major consultations in that process. The district planning process all together in 2018, 2019. And they've been taking that forward since that time as the major public consultation. Everything. So they just rezoned 1,200 properties based on the fact that they did their major consultation in 2017, 2018, 2019. At what point in time is that too far back to constitute public consultation for today?
Well,
I know it's specific, but
well, I'm sorry, Maria, I just didn't hear you.
sorry, I just want to make sure that you were able to get the question.
Yeah. I think I understood the question. I just beg your pardon that it's a little hard for me to put the sentences together. Consultation is as good as the consensus that it represents. When the consensus starts to erode, the consultation, the solutions out of that consultation become passé, and they have to be renewed. So one of the ways that you can deal with a consultation which you think is no longer relevant, or represents past opinion, or maybe never was good in its depth and quality, is to have some more consultation. And I go back to my premise. If government will not convene it, you convene it. And when your consultation has several hundred people or maybe several thousand people involved, I will guarantee you that in a local political process, someone will come to the fore to be your agent in those formal processes where you can't speak. And that will start the process. I don't think that there can be any law limiting your community's ability to speak to one another and express yourself. Even though the government might hide behind, I shouldn't say this about your government because I don't want to comment on your government, even though a government might hide behind a bylaw or a regulation which they've made to justify their action. And so, again, you've done something amazing in your community, which I haven't seen happen as well in many other cities of Canada. And that is, you have this coalition happening. You have meetings like this happening. Now go to those places, those areas, and you can help one another. One neighborhood can help another neighborhood where there's particularly hot contesting going on, and convene that conversation and make it very public and very loud.
Examples of public and loud. I love that we're all here and within our own communities. I'm sure we've written, emailed, tried to get a walk around with our counselor who doesn't return email and is busy. In your experience, how have you seen action? How do they know that a letter from the community or a coalition has 3,000 names behind when you're a city of 1 million? What have you seen in your experience that is noise? Do we march down? We're preaching to the choir amongst ourselves. And so we really have to, you're right, let our counselors know. But very smart people go down and talk to them, and boy, it's a challenge to get this council to hear. And be positive. Nobody's saying don't do Infill or don't densify. We're trying to come up with brilliant ideas, but it really is a challenge.
Yeah. The weakest position you have is when you have an individual conversation or you have a conversation with just a couple of people, a few people involved. The more any politician can know that every word coming out of your mouth represents the message from 50 people. In fact, many theorists tell us it's 20 people. The more you'll be listened to. That's just the ugly reality of modern democracy, assuming it's fluid and not filled with illegalities, which is happening in some places. But so I think you pull your people together and you don't settle with 5 or 10 or 20. You have meetings. You don't wait for them to convene meetings. You call meetings yourself. And it's a good way to test whether or not you are articulating a widely held view or not, because you also don't know that until you really begin to talk. And structure those meetings so that you're not just telling people the problem. You're spending a lot of time letting people tell you their take on the problem. I just, it's maybe cynical, but maybe it's the other side of that. It's optimistic. Everywhere in this country where democracy works, I've seen government respond. And where democracy is not working, either as officially sanctioned or as happens spontaneously, then yes, the powers that be are going to do what they want to do, how they want to do, when they want to do, and how quickly they want to do it. But when you start to get your community speaking its echoed mind together, echo over echo over echo, it just always works that people start paying attention. Now, what they may start doing is say, why didn't you planners do that? And then the planners have to say, because you didn't allow us to, right? But wherever it is, and if it's the other side, if the planner is one of those planners who's not been embracing a public engagement, their job will be on the line if there's enough people that are upset. Believe me, it will be true. And that's a very easy thing to operationalize in a bureaucracy. So it's all about people power. And I can't emphasize that enough. And I don't want to suggest that means that, you all go and have riots at City Hall. No. It's about people power and the power of positive ideas spoken by those people.
Creativity and the examples of creativity really flow from a group like this. Doing things that we know what doesn't work. And so the ideas that come, whether it's an Instagram account, whether it's signs from Edmonton Neighbourhoods United, whether it's something else that's made clever, that we can start to use a different questions.
I actually have a two-part question and just a comment. So I can speak to the people in Calgary, and I spoke to the guy that was doing the lawsuit, and I spoke to the guy, the people that were doing the certain covenant, and what they said was it was signs that were the most effective. They tell the developer visual visibility is.
I have to interrupt. I can't understand that person.
I'm gonna translate it.
I'm so sorry. I have to say that.
Larry, thank you so much for coming, but I have a question about restrictive covenants. Do you find that those work? And then my second question is, have you come across a situation where community owners have gathered into a not-for-profit and actually purchased lands that has come available, but a restrictive covenant on it, and then turned around and sold it ahead of the development? That's what my reasons are.
Yeah, there are techniques such as that. They're usually costly, and a few communities can marshal the funds that do that. Occasionally, a community can form a community trust where they all sign up for something and will all put it on their title, register on the titles. Anything registered on title is powerful. And if you can convince all your neighbors with you to have a mass movement of restrictive covenants, that will work. Trouble is, it's only going to be those who volunteer, and the rest are going to do what they want to do. And if what you're worried about is spot change that could make everything change, it's a long, expensive process. So I don't rule those things out. And maybe you have you build a movement of it, but I still believe the political process is probably the more expedient way to go.
But which is the whole point of having the two things together though, like having the restrictive covenant as one thing and then having a group that purchases properties, puts a restrictive covenant on it, and then sells the property.
Well, yeah. For example, I'll give you an example. Savannah in the United States has one of the most beautiful heritage settings of buildings in the world, really. And back in the 60s, a community organization started doing just that. They would buy a building, any building that came up, they would buy it. They would put the covenants on it, and then they would sell it on. Often they would try to find the right kind of buyers also who would want a heritage in that. And the reason it had some positive effect was that it was a coalition of very wealthy families who just decided to put their wealth to that purpose, because every single property sold at market. And unfortunately, one of the problems was that when the seller knew that this was going to occur, they would up the price even further. And so it became kind of, it was only so effective. It wasn't very effective in the long run because they couldn't sustain that level of wealth. Now, I would argue that in our cities more recently, where we do see escalation in value, there probably is wealth to be built into that. But I would work with a very, clever real estate advisor to see where and how that might occur. But the other thing I would say, never think you're so right about what you just said last, never think there's one solution to anything. You could have a movement of restrictive covenants where people voluntarily do that because this is what they believe in, declare your belief. And you can also have a community organization, and you can also be advocating politically, and you can be doing a whole host of things. And that's where I just simply go back to my advice, which is the more voices you can bring to each of those measures, the more powerful it will be.
Yeah, first of all, what is a charter city? Maybe somebody here can help me. What is a charter city and why is Edmonton one?
The question is, and it's a little technical, what is a charter city? And is Edmonton and Calgary are charter cities? Just an explanation of what that means and
where did it come from?
And where did it come from? And Larry, you might be able to answer this, but there are other people who also.
I'll give you just a sentence or two, and then you can bring it down to the Alberta circumstances. Across our countries, there are some cities that have an individual charter for that city, which means at the provincial level, there is a law governing that city's rules and regulations. And those laws, because they're a law for each city, each of those can be different laws. So, for example, Vancouver is a charter city. Most of the rest of the cities in British Columbia come under the Municipal Act. So we were able to do things in Vancouver that they were not allowed to do elsewhere. And often Vancouver would use as a model, and then if it worked, well, they would allow other cities to do it. So it's just you have a charter or a law that is made for your city itself, and you can change it, only changing the legal framework of your city, your particular city. Now, there may be more to it in Alberta.
That's the at the beginning of your talk, you talked about we need to know what the problem is in our city. We need to know where it's coming from, what the source of it is. and so we can find an appropriate solution. So my question has always been, where did the idea or the vision for Edmonton come from that we have to have 600,000 more people within the Henday? Where did this idea come that we need to plant X amount of trees? What is fueling that? What is dictating that? And where is that coming from? Is it coming from people in neighborhoods decided, oh, we need to have all these people here? Or is this coming from somewhere else? And if it's coming from somewhere else, it doesn't negate any of this local stuff, but we need to understand where it's coming from. Because I heard about, I think Los Angeles, a lady found out about a development in her city. Nobody wanted it, so why was it happening? She traced it back and eventually traced it back to the UN and policies that were coming out of the UN. So it's called Behind the Green Mask. So I'm asking, where is this coming from? Is this something that Edmontonians have birthed and conceived of and are working toward, or is this something that's coming down from other levels of government or even beyond government? So we need to know where it's coming from. We still need to act locally, but we need to know where it's coming from.
Well, you're echoing what I have advised from the very beginning. Rather than just say you're mad about it, something happening, go to the source of where it is coming from. Now, many of these kind of issues are coming from the general society anxiety about how do we accommodate growth. And some political people and some professional planners are trying to just be expedient. Let's get rid of all the confusion and we know what to do. That was one of the that has always been a very big historical problem because often they don't know what they think they know. But I would say to you, that question, because it seems to be fairly profound, is one that your whole coalition should take under advisement and get to the bottom of. Is it driven by the consumer side of the demand? Is it driven by some philosophical predisposition? Is it driven by some other imperative? What is it driven by? And then you'll know how to deal with it. Number one, you may understand it. Number two, you may understand it but don't agree with it. And if you don't understand it, you will know where to focus your conversation. I mean, the best way I can answer your question is to say, it is a good question. So find the answer.
Yeah, because when I see the city responding the way it does to eloquent arguments from well-researched citizens saying, no, we have this city plan that we voted for or that we brought in, and no argument seems to be working, then it says to me something else is driving.
Well, there's also another factor which I commend you to seriously take into consideration, and that is some people in the bureaucracy and some politicians will use the power of a law to avoid dealing with the downsides of a law. They will say, we have a new plan, shut up. And if that's what's happening, enough of you have to say, your plan has this flaw, this flaw, this flaw, this flaw, it needs review. A plan is only as good as the consensus that it represents in a democracy. So, you need to, I'm just reinforcing what you're questioning, speaker is questioning, because you need to get to the bottom of what is that. Is it some imperative? We're all trying to have more environmental sustainability. So we're doing things and asking people to do things that we never did before. There's certain societal imperatives and sometimes there's legal imperatives. And sometimes that go beyond, say, a local government. And sometimes there are political imperatives. So where is it in your town? But I would argue, be skeptical with anyone who says to you, that's what the plan says, so just be quiet. I never would use that, and I used to I still create the plans.
Great. I want to make sure everybody has a chance. We're going to close off, but not, and sorry.
Well, I have a question, but I should be at the bottom of the list. I'd love it if other people who haven't spoken yet have a.
Yes.
So one, in Crestwood, we're starting to see these 8-unit apartments being plopped down on 50 wide lots. And in the other cities that I looked at, Calgary, for instance, which is touted still as the fastest growing city, it allows 4 in their new blanket zoning bylaw, which is before the courts right now. But is there any reason why here 8 seems to be it's such a huge number that they're bunking down? I know there's a CMHC gift for 5 or more doors, but is that it? Like the developers just seem to have caught on to this, it seems. We're only just finding out in the last couple of months because we're seeing it. But is there any reasoning behind the 8, like why that is suddenly happening in Edmonton versus the other cities?
Good question. Edmonton is unique, Larry.
Yeah. My first answer is, I hope you won't be offended by this, but my first answer is if the law allows 9, it'll be 9. If the law allows 7, it'll be 7. If the law allows 4, it'll be 4. Just yesterday, I was talking to a developer and I said to him, what kind of development do you want to do? And he said, I'll do the maximum I can get away with. And if you take the cynicism out of that and you stay with the facts of that, all he's saying is that he has to maximize whatever he can economically pull out of that investment in that property. So there may be, I do not know any objective planning analysis that's come to the conclusion that 8 units is better than 7 or 6 or 5 or 4. I just don't know it. In fact, my first reaction on hearing about the number 8 was that it's simply too much. In most neighborhoods I have worked in, and I have worked in many small scale neighborhoods that are scaled at 2 and 3 stories, 8 seems a lot. So, I can't imagine a theoretical or societal reason for 8.
Question, Larry. I don't have a chance to ask.
This might be beyond the scope of this meeting, but I've been told in my community that the community league can't be political. And I wonder if you don't want to answer, somebody could ask me, is there such a rule? Should we give a damn about such a rule or what?
And remember, I want to continue these conversations with us over coffee. There
Yeah.
are so many people in this room who have answers to a lot of these questions. This is an amazing room, I have to say. But I'm going to put your question to Larry. Can you just sort of
Is there a rule that says community leagues, which I believe are unique to Edmonton?
Yes.
Unique in all of Canada. Is there a rule that says we can't be political?
So the question is, Larry, whether or not there's any prohibition on community leagues as an entity being political.
Well, I don't frankly know any law that limits an organization from being political if it wishes to be political. And in fact, if there was such a law, I would attack it immediately in and of itself.
Yes.
I would be happy to address that later, once the whole discussion.
I'll look you up.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Okay.
And it may be, by the way, let me just add a bit. If you did find such a law, there's nothing that says you couldn't have a kindred organization that falls outside that law to make the voice heard.
Actually,
That's what often happens with other people who have limitations. They find another voice through a foundation or something to make their views known. I would tell you as a citizen, any limit on your ability to participate in this democracy, you have to find a way around.
thank you. That's great. Kevin's got a closing question, I think, and then we're going to stay and
Sure. So very wonderful comments here. I want to go back to one of your early early comments about the value of variety across neighborhoods. That's not the word you use, but I used to be a political figure, and I remember a conversation with a city councillor in Edmonton about 10 years ago in which he said to allow one thing to happen in one neighborhood and not to in another is to be unfair. To treat neighborhoods differently from each other is to be unfair to those neighborhoods. And at the time, I didn't say anything, but as I thought about it, I found I profoundly disagreed. When I go to a city, if every neighborhood is exactly the same, it's a boring city. It just loses its character. You think of the great cities of the world and how you want to walk around and experience different neighborhoods or drive around. So we now that conversation from that previous city councilor from years ago, it got channeled into the current city plan and zoning bylaws in which neighborhoods are largely treated exactly the same. There's no heritage neighborhood. There's no variance allowed among neighborhoods in any profound way. What are your feelings? How can a city plan embrace diversity across neighborhoods and do it well?
Well, first thing is, let me say in principle, as a city planner, I would never want to see a city where all the neighborhoods were the same. You have to expect, if that is the case, the lowest common denominator and the highest common denominator are going to rule the day. So every neighborhood, I live in a neighborhood where all buildings are 25 stories. Does that mean every neighborhood should have 25-story buildings everywhere? I don't think so. I know someone who lives in a neighborhood that's filled with heritage buildings. Well, you can't save heritage buildings because you have to let them do what every other neighborhood does, and that means you get rid of heritage buildings. In fact, at a philosophical level, if you buy my principle, and I think it is widely held, that our cities, the character is brought together by the incredible mosaic of our neighborhoods, then the more diversity and the more uniqueness that you can sustain, the better. And when you go to those cities, and all of us have gone to some cities which have not made that important, you want to get out of there fast. I have a friend that calls them one-day cities or two-day cities. And then more importantly, not as a visitor, but as a resident, you want choice in your life. And cities should offer you that choice. Some people like physical luxury. Some people like social gatherings. Some people like noise. Some people like quiet. And you have to try to maximize the diversity of choice that you offer to all of our citizens. And when you do that, I can tell you, you get a city that's incredibly resilient, that can sustain all the negativity, but even more importantly, you get a city that is some place I want to be and everyone else wants to be. And so never fall for any argument that says that, you've got to be, it just falls apart in the most fundamental sense. Across the road from me is another rule. Well, it applies to the people who all abide by that rule, but that's all. It doesn't apply to me.
Theme for us to end on. Before we thank Larry, just have somebody who'd like to do a bit of a pitch. Yeah. Okay. Well, Larry, look at me. I really feel like there's a community building that you us a lot with today. I think a lot of us are hearing from you the experience of decades of working not just top down, but from bottom up, and living with people who are living with ideas that you come around to understanding and improving. It's an iteration, and that sort of back and forth, I think, is what we're hungry for in this city, and we've missed terribly. But I just want to thank you on behalf of all of us for contributing to this conversation. it's fueled a lot of thinking, and people are gonna leave on a very positive note about what we can do moving ahead. Thank you, Larry.
Well, thank you, Marie. Thank you, and thank you all. And I really support your energy, your courage, and the power it's going to give you. So I'll say goodbye on that note. Bye bye.